Hello students, this is Professor McDermott. Well, the official topic for this lecture is the United States under the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation, talking about the first American governments. I use that plural word to remind us that there was not only a federal government, but also state governments that were also extremely important at that time. But before we get into that topic, we need to finish up with the American Revolution. So we'll pick up where we left off with the beginnings of the United States Navy, founded in October 1775 by the Continental Congress. And the following month, the Congress also began the United States Marine Corps. But the United States really didn't have a very large navy during the American Revolution, and in fact, most of the fighting that we did at sea was carried out not by the official navy, but by what were called privateers. Privateers were basically glorified pirates. So essentially, Congress would give a ship's captain a license to prey on British shipping and destroy, sink, or capture British ships. And there were more than 800 privateers who were commissioned by Congress during the American Revolution, and those privateers were responsible for the capture or the sinking of more than 600 British merchant vessels. So they did have an impact on British shipping and the British economy during the war. From the regular Navy, the most famous naval officer on the American side during the Revolution was John Paul Jones. Jones is an interesting character. He was from Scotland, and as a young sailor in the British Navy, he had gotten into a fight with his ship's captain and had actually wound up murdering the captain. So he had escaped, but of course there was a price on his head, and so Jones actually fled to the colonies to beat this murder rap. And so when the war broke out, Jones was very happy to join the American Navy and fight against the country that was trying to hang him. It was Jones who, for the only time during the war, actually took the war into England when he raided some towns on the British coastline, the only fighting that actually took place in England. But his most famous moment during the Revolution came on September the 23rd, 1779. Jones was commanding a ship called the Bonhomme Richard, and this in French means good man Richard or poor Richard. So Jones's ship was actually named after Franklin in his character of Poor Richard from the Almanac. And the Bonhomme Richard was fighting against His Majesty's ship, Serapis. And during this very fierce fight, at one point, the American flag fell to the deck amid the intense firing. And the British ship's captain called across to Jones and asked, has your ship struck? Meaning, have you surrendered? And Jones immediately replied, quote, I have not yet begun to fight, end quote. So these were words that really rang down through American history. I do want to mention the contribution of the Spanish to the American war effort, because not only the French but the Spanish actually got into the revolution on the American side. But normally we tend to forget or downplay that. But I want to especially focus on a man who I consider to be one of the great heroes of the American Revolution, namely Bernardo de Galvez. Galvez was a Spaniard who, in 1777, was appointed the governor of Louisiana. And he became very interested in the American cause, and in fact, secretly, even before Spain got into the war, was supplying weapons and supplies to George Rogers Clark. When Clark invaded the Midwest and captured those three forts in Illinois and Indiana, he was able to do that largely because Galvez had supplied his army. So you can be certain that when Spain did finally officially enter the war on the American side on June 21st, 1779, that Galvez was raring to go and to contribute to the war effort. And he immediately began putting together an army of the citizens of Louisiana. And this was a very interesting and unusual fighting force for the time, because Louisiana then, as now, was a very multicultural place. And so in this army, Galvez had Spaniards, he had Mexicans, he had Frenchmen left over from the time when French controlled Louisiana. He had the Cajuns, who were French Canadians who had been deported from Canada earlier by the English. He had Irish, he had Indians, Native Americans, he had African Americans, he had mulattoes, all kinds of people who joined in this fighting force. And with this army, Galvez's first target was the British fort at present-day Mobile, Alabama, Fort Charlotte. And in March 1780, Galvez's army did manage to take that fort and conquer Mobile. And then Galvez set his sights on the very important British military installation at Pensacola, Florida. And Galvez and his force laid siege to Pensacola. And then finally on May 9th, 1781, succeeded with their artillery in blowing up a storehouse full of gunpowder, which severely damaged the fort and led the British at Pensacola to surrender. And actually, if you count the number of British troops that surrendered at Pensacola, this was, in numerical terms, the third largest British defeat of the war, after Yorktown, which we'll talk about shortly, and Saratoga. So this was really a very important event that you don't really hear too much about in American history textbooks, but if you ever get a chance to go to Pensacola, you can learn more about it at the really excellent living history museums that they have down there. Well, as a result of his contribution to the war effort during the Revolution, the King of Spain appointed Galvez the Viceroy of Mexico in 1785. That meant he was basically an assistant king in Mexico. But unfortunately, Galvez died young. He died in very mysterious circumstances in the year 1786 and faded from history. But there is one memorial to Galvez in the United States. The city of Galveston, Texas, is named after Bernardo de Galvez, an important but little-known hero of the American Revolution. Well, it's interesting. If you look at the question of who actually made up the Continental Army, and I think a lot of people have assumed that the American Army in this war was made up of WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, when actually nothing could be further from the truth. Many observers gave a very different picture of the American Army and its makeup. For example, one of General Howe's secretaries, Ambrose Searle, made the following rather snide comment during the 1776 campaign for New York City. He said, quote, "Old men of 60, boys of 14, and blacks of all ages compose the motley crew." End quote. And you might think that was the comment of a rather snotty British officer trying to put down this upstart Continental Army. But even our allies pointed out the unusual composition of the army. For example, Baron Dubourg, a French officer, said, quote, "It is inconceivable that troops nearly naked, badly paid, and composed of old men, Negroes, and children, should march so well." End quote. And so with those comments, I think you get a glimpse of a Continental Army that looked very different from the one we might imagine. As a matter of fact, as early as January 1776, Congress allowed the recruitment of free African Americans into the Continental Army. And about 5,000 free blacks served in the American Army during the war. In the illustration there at the left, you see a rare image of a black American soldier drawn by one of the French soldiers at the Battle of Yorktown. Now, it is true that oftentimes when African Americans served in the Army, they were forced to take on the more menial tasks, things like cooking and digging latrines and so forth. But there were many African Americans who did get a chance to serve in the Army. And as the war went on and people grew tired of the war and it became more and more difficult to recruit for the military, Congress opened up the ranks of the Army even more broadly and allowed indentured servants from Ireland to join, as well as criminals. So essentially, jails were being emptied to supply the Continental Army. And finally, even slaves were recruited into the Continental Army by the end of the war. And you have to wonder, even though African Americans really, in a sense, did not have a great deal to gain from the Americans winning the war. In fact, quite a few African Americans were able to get their freedom by joining the British Army. The British offered African American slaves freedom if they could manage to get to the British Army lines and join up. And then some of those newly freed blacks were able to move to places like Nova Scotia in Canada after the war and live lives as free men. So, in many ways, the American cause was not the cause of African Americans, but you have to wonder for those slaves and free blacks who did join the Continental Army if that may have planted a seed or a hope that someday freedom would come to all of their people. It's an interesting question to speculate about. But in spite of the broader recruiting that was going on, by the end of the war, the Army really had shrunk down to about 5,000 men, and the few men that were left were very discontented, and you even see mutinies, rebellions taking place among soldiers from Pennsylvania and New Jersey, for example, because of the lack of pay and the living conditions in the Army. And so things really were difficult as the war dragged on. There was a lot of battle fatigue on the home front. Another setback or another blow to American morale had to do with one of the most talented and important American generals, Benedict Arnold, who had played a really glorious role in the victory at Saratoga. He was a very capable military commander, but at Saratoga he was wounded severely in the leg. And to help him recuperate, Washington appointed him to be the governor, the military governor of Philadelphia after the British left in 1778. Now, Arnold was a brave man, but he had kind of a prickly personality, and the citizens of Philadelphia really did not like Arnold. And in fact, many of them began to accuse him of abusing his power, and especially of corruption in terms of appropriating supplies for his own use and confiscated belongings from loyalists and so forth. And this really upset Benedict Arnold. He was cleared of all wrongdoing, but he felt that his honor had been stained, and he felt that the American people were very ungrateful to him after the great sacrifices he had made for the American war effort. And so, secretly, of course, in 1780, Arnold began negotiating with the British High Command in New York City for terms on which he would begin working for them. And so, having come to an agreement, Arnold turned traitor. And it just so happened that in July 1780 he was put into a really magnificent position to do a lot of damage to the American cause when he became the commander of the fort at West Point on the Hudson River. Now, today, West Point is the home of the United States Military Academy, which didn't exist at that time. But West Point was a very, very important and strategic installation, military fort on the Hudson River. And essentially, whoever controlled West Point controlled the Hudson. And so, unbeknownst to Washington and Congress, Arnold began preparing to hand over West Point to the British. But on the morning of September 23rd, General George Washington, with his staff, appeared at West Point, making a surprise visit to inspect the facility. And Washington sat down to breakfast with Benedict Arnold. And pretty soon, here comes a messenger notifying Washington that a British officer had been captured near the fort with incriminating documents stuffed into his boot. Well, when Arnold heard this, he excused himself, got up from the table, went out to the stables, grabbed a horse, and immediately rode off towards New York City, because the British officer who had been captured was Major John Andre, who was Arnold's contact among the British, and the papers were papers that Arnold had given him as part of the plan to turn over the fort. Well, in a little while it dawned on Washington that it was actually Arnold who was the traitor. And he was completely shocked and in total disbelief, and he was heard to say, quote, "Whom can we trust now?" End quote. Because Arnold was such a well-regarded American general. And so, in a way, it really struck at the heart of the American cause, and it made people paranoid and wonder if there were traitors lurking everywhere. The fact that such a great American as Benedict Arnold could become a turncoat. But other Americans put a positive spin on the sequence of events at West Point. For example, General Nathanael Greene said, quote, "The providential train of circumstances affords the most convincing proofs that the liberty of America are the object of divine protection." In other words, Greene was saying that clearly God had arranged that George Washington would just happen to show up at West Point on that particular morning, just in time to foil the plot and save West Point. And so, like the evacuation of Brooklyn Heights with the mysterious fog that rolled in, this became additional proof for many Americans that God was on the American side. Well, I mentioned in the lecture in class that aside from spectacular events like the Battle of Trenton, in general, Washington had a very cautious strategy during the American Revolution, and he very rarely instigated a battle with the British. And that was certainly not from cowardice. It was actually excellent strategy. Washington knew that in almost every situation the American army would be outnumbered. He knew that the British were better equipped, better supplied, better trained. And he didn't want to risk having his army be captured or annihilated in an open battle with the British. Instead, his strategy was simply to harass the British, to wear them down whenever possible, to attack only when victory was completely certain or when he knew he could do some damage with little risk. His goal was to simply keep his army in the field. He knew that if he could just keep the American army intact for long enough, eventually the British public would grow tired of the war and would simply give up. We call this kind of war a war of attrition. It's basically a knockdown, drag-out fight trying to see who is the last man standing, in which each side simply tries to wear each other down. That's a war of attrition. And there were many people in the United States who criticized Washington for this strategy, even in Congress. And at different times, there were efforts made to remove Washington from the command of the army because people wanted more action. You know, people always want to see results instantly. But Washington was smarter than that, and he knew that really this was the only way that the United States was going to be able to defeat the British, and ultimately he was proven right. Now, after the failure of their Hudson River strategy, the British adopted a new master plan which focused on the southern states. And part of the reason for that was that the British believed, correctly, that there were a large number of loyalists, Tories, who were living in the South. And they hoped that by invading the South, they would draw those people, in a sense, out of hiding and induce them to join the British war effort. So really the goal of the British campaign in the South was to promote a civil war between the loyalists there and the patriots. And so really this became a very terrifying campaign, and it was brother against brother, you could say, in the South during the latter part of the American Revolution with this British campaign. Another goal was that the British, knowing that Washington was a Southerner from Virginia, hoped that by attacking his home region, they would force Washington to take action and draw him out of his cautious strategy and induce him to fight them. And they hoped then they could annihilate the Continental Army. Well, in a sense, the first step of this was the capture of Savannah in December of 1778. But really, the Southern strategy did not get into full swing until a major expedition was mounted into South Carolina. General Sir Henry Clinton and Lord Cornwallis attacked Charleston, South Carolina, with 11,500 British troops and captured that city on May 11th, 1780. And then Cornwallis penetrated deeper into the interior of South Carolina. The next major battle was at Waxhaw, South Carolina, and this battle became infamous because of the action of a British colonel named Banastre Tarleton. During this battle, 350 Virginia troops tried to surrender to the British, and of course, according to the laws of war and civilized warfare, when a soldier is trying to surrender, you're supposed to accept the surrender, and you're supposed to take him prisoner and put him in a prisoner of war camp and feed him and take care of him for the duration of the war, or else let him off on parole. But that is not what Tarleton did. Instead, he had ordered his troops to massacre the 350 Virginians who had surrendered on the pretext that they were rebels and traitors and therefore did not deserve to be treated as soldiers but rather as criminals. And this became very famous as Tarleton's Quarter. Quarter is just another word for mercy. So this was how Tarleton showed mercy, by massacring those 350 Virginia troops at Waxhaw. Then came an even more crushing American defeat at Camden, South Carolina, when Cornwallis defeated American troops under General Horatio Gates badly. And Gates was so shaken by this defeat that he jumped on his horse and rode 250 miles from the battlefield without stopping. Generals were not supposed to do things like that. And that resulted in Gates's disgrace and eventual removal from the army. So things were really looking bad by August 1780 for the Americans in the South. However, shortly after that, the worm turned and things began looking up. The first sign of life for the American cause in the South took place at Kings Mountain in the western mountainous part of South Carolina on October the 7th. And it's interesting that the American force at Kings Mountain was made up largely of frontiersmen from the mountains of East Tennessee, and they were so angry when they got the news of the Battle of Waxhaw that they decided to travel across the mountains and to join the American army. And so at Kings Mountain, some British troops tried to surrender. And of course, as you can imagine, these Tennessee settlers did not allow them to surrender. They massacred them just the same way Tarleton had massacred the Virginians at Waxhaw. And as they did so, they shouted, "Tarleton's quarter! Tarleton's quarter!" to rub it in. Then, in January of 1781, there was a very important battle at a place called the Cowpens. The commander for the Americans at this battle was General Daniel Morgan, and he decided to use a trick. He told his raw militia, who had never fought before, to stand up in front and to fire off one volley of gunfire with their muskets, and then to run away like they were retreating and scared. And the British took the bait, and they began running after these troops, thinking that they were in full flight. And then Morgan ordered his seasoned veterans to come forward and surround the British. And this was a smashing victory at Cowpens for the Americans. The trick worked, and 100 British soldiers were killed, and 500 were captured. So suddenly things were looking up for the American cause in the South. Now I want to explain the sequence of events that ultimately led to the decisive victory of the war at Yorktown. Benedict Arnold had been eager to get into battle now as a British general. And so he, in January of 1781, led a detachment of British troops into Virginia. Washington was concerned about this, and so he sent the Marquis de Lafayette down into Virginia to try to trap Arnold if he could. And that went on for a while, but in early summer, Washington got some very good news. The French general Rochambeau told Washington that the French fleet, the French Navy, under the command of Admiral Comte de Grasse, was getting ready to cruise up and down the American seacoast. And Washington saw his opportunity. If he could surround the British on land while de Grasse's fleet kept the British from evacuating by sea, he would have the British in a trap. And so immediately he ordered the remainder of the Continental Army to move south. And the French soldiers who were with him also went on this expedition. Lord Cornwallis had his British troops at Yorktown in Virginia. And so Washington was able to surround Cornwallis at Yorktown, and I think it's very interesting. There were 16,000 troops on the American side at Yorktown. 9,000 of them were Americans, but actually 7,000 of them were French. And if you count the French sailors who were patrolling the coastline, really there were more French troops in this battle than there were Americans. And so the plan worked perfectly. Washington began to lay siege to Yorktown, and Cornwallis could not escape from Yorktown by sea because the French fleet was patrolling up and down the coast. And so the British were trapped, and by October the 19th, Cornwallis' situation was hopeless, and he surrendered his entire army of 8,000 British troops. Ironically, General Sir Henry Clinton showed up uh, in the Chesapeake Bay near Yorktown with 7,000 troops 5 days later, but it was too late. Cornwallis had already surrendered. And I just want to mention, as a way of underlining the importance of the French and Spanish contribution, that it was actually the French and the Spanish who paid all the troops at Yorktown, including the American troops. So once again, really, I don't think you can underestimate the importance of these allies, France and Spain, to the American war effort. When the news about Yorktown got to London, the British Prime Minister, Lord North, was said to have started banging his desk and shouting in agony, "Oh God, it is over! It is all over!" Because he knew that, having lost a second major army to the Americans, that the British public would never tolerate continuing the war, and that turned out to be true. The fighting did drag on for another couple of years, but finally in 1783 a treaty was signed, the Treaty of Paris, in which the British did recognize American independence, and the war was officially over. So this is what the new republic, the United States of America, looked like in its early years. You see the 13 original states plus the 14th state, Vermont, and the 15th state, Kentucky. And of course, the question was how to organize this new nation. And the first plan under which the United States of America were organized was called the Articles of Confederation. Now, this plan had been proposed as early as 1777, but it was actually not approved by Congress until 1781, and I'll explain why in just a minute. But when it did take effect in 1781, the Articles of Confederation provided for a very weak central government, under which most of the power still belonged to the state governments. So there was a national government, but there was no executive branch in the national government, so there was no president. There was also no judiciary branch, so no federal courts. The only branch that existed in the federal government under the Articles was the legislative branch, but Congress, under the Articles, had no power to levy taxes at all, and you can understand why that provision was made. After all, the American Revolution had been fought primarily because of British taxes, and the Americans didn't want the Congress to have that power. But it really handicapped Congress, and if the Congress needed money for any purpose, they had to go hand in hand to the states and beg the states for money, and obviously that didn't work out very well. The only matters that Congress was allowed to control were warfare, diplomacy, foreign affairs, and creating the money supply for the nation. Furthermore, in Congress, basically each state voted as a block, and each state got one vote. So on every question, essentially, there were only 13 votes. Each state voted as a unit, no matter how large or how small it was. And so this gave the smaller states a really big advantage. Furthermore, the Articles said that if you wanted to change the Articles, it required a unanimous vote. That is, all 13 states had to vote for the change. And of course, that is extremely difficult to get 13 clocks to chime at the same time, as John Adams put it. And so, essentially, America was saddled with the Articles of Confederation, which could not be amended, and which made for a really powerless national government. I mentioned that the ratification or the approval of the articles had been delayed for 4 years, and the reason was that nearly all the states had land claims on the frontier in the West, and they just couldn't agree as to who was going to get those frontier lands. So I'll come back to this slide in a second, but looking at the map, you see the different land claims that different states had. For example, North Carolina claimed Tennessee, Georgia claimed parts of Alabama and Mississippi, Connecticut claimed part of northeastern Ohio, and essentially Virginia claimed everything. According to its charter, Virginia believed it was entitled to all the frontier lands all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So there was kind of a deadlock on this issue of who would control these back lands. Now, there were a couple states that didn't have any land claims on the frontier, Delaware and Maryland, and it was these states that instigated the compromise that ultimately solved the problem. They suggested that all of these frontier areas should be ceded, that is, given up by the states to the national government, and they should become a national domain, which Congress could then decide what to do with. And ultimately, this is what was agreed on. And so these frontier areas became the property of the nation rather than the individual states. And the Articles of Confederation then were passed and became the first framework of the American government. Now, there were already settlers who were flocking into the frontier areas. Now, of course, the British Proclamation of 1763 was canceled with the American victory, and people were really eager to get their hands on this land, so it became a top priority for Congress to try to remove the obstacle in the way of these settlers, which was, of course, the presence of Indian tribes. And so in 1784, Congress negotiated the Treaty of Fort Stanwix with the Iroquois, who had been defeated, of course, badly during the American Revolution by the Americans. And essentially, the Iroquois were forced to cede most of their lands in New York. And in so doing, they also gave up lands that they claimed they owned in the Ohio River Valley, even though actually these lands belonged to other Indian tribes, such as the Delaware, the Shawnee, and the Mingo. So obviously those other groups did not like that, and this meant that a new treaty was necessary in 1785, the Treaty of Fort McIntosh, in which the Delaware, Huron, and Miami tribes conceded a large amount of land in Ohio and in other future Midwestern states. And that really opened the way for settlement in the region that historians call the Old Northwest. So then Congress had to decide how they were going to organize this frontier area, and they got Thomas Jefferson to lead the way in drafting an ordinance in 1784 to try to create a blueprint for settlement. Now, ultimately, Congress did not agree with all of Jefferson's ideas. For example, he wanted to give away the land to anyone who would come and farm it. Jefferson loved farmers. He thought that farmers were the salt of the earth and the backbone of America. And so he wanted to really promote agriculture by giving away this land. And as you can see from the illustration there on the left, Jefferson's plan was to divide the whole region into several new states that he gave kind of strange names like Pellicipia and Polypotamia. And Congress really didn't accept that suggestion either. But there was one part of Jefferson's plan that they did accept, and they included it in the Ordinance of 1785, and that was what we call the grid. Now, Jefferson had a very mathematical mind, and essentially he drew lines 6 miles apart on the map going north and south and going east and west, and essentially divided the entire region into squares that were 6 miles on each side. And this was to be the basis for the distribution of land, and Congress liked that idea and they kept this. So essentially the entire region of the Northwest above the Ohio River was divided into townships, 6 miles square, and then each township was divided into 36 smaller squares, and each of the smaller squares comprised 640 acres. And you can see this a little more easily on this illustration. So if you look at the blue region in southeastern Ohio, and you see how it's broken out there at the bottom with the lines that were 6 miles apart. And then at the middle, on the bottom row there, you see one township, 36 square miles with its 36 smaller squares of 1 square mile each. And then on the right, you see broken out again one of those smaller squares. And each of these smaller squares you could buy basically half of that, which would be 320 acres, or you could buy a quarter of that, which would be 160, or you could buy 80 acres, or you could buy 40 acres. And so essentially the land was sold and distributed in a very mathematical and geometrical way. And you can actually see this if you ever go to those states, or even better if you fly over the states of Ohio, Illinois, Indiana. You can clearly see the effects of the grid pattern, or if you drive through those states, you'll notice that the country roads are absolutely straight as an arrow, usually for several miles, because they follow the boundaries of the squares. And then every now and then they might zigzag, but then they quickly get back on the straight and narrow. And it's all to do with Jefferson's grid. And all of this was finally embodied in what was perhaps the greatest legislative achievement of Congress under the Articles of Confederation, the law called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which was very important for a number of reasons. First of all, the Northwest Ordinance invented the procedure by which territories, frontier territories, could become American states, and it really set an important precedent for this process later in American history. And the rule was that any territory that had acquired 60,000 male inhabitants, each of whom owned 50 acres of land, could petition Congress for statehood. And eventually, actually, the requirements became lower, really, in practice, but that was the norm: 60,000 men with 50 acres of land each in order to become a state. And under this procedure, you see the different states that became part of the United States: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin in the Old Northwest. Also, very significant, the Northwest Ordinance said that slavery was completely illegal and forbidden in this Northwest territory. And that was adhered to by and large in the Old Northwest. And that is the reason that ultimately all of these states became free states and fought on the Union side during the Civil War. Also important, I think, is that within each township, 36 square miles, 1 square mile, one of the little squares, was set aside to support public education. And the idea was that this land would be sold and that the money would go to promote schools. But the way these schools were created was very different from our modern ideas of public education. The Northwest Ordinance Article 3 said this on the subject of education, quote, "Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged," end quote. In other words, all the schools in the Northwest Territory were operated by churches, and it was taken for granted that schools would be parochial schools. They would be church operated. And furthermore, that public money from the sale of these lands would go to support these essentially Christian schools. And of course, that is illegal nowadays. But in the early republic, the boundary lines between church and state were considerably more blurry than they are today. Also important is the language of Article 3 of the ordinance about relationships with the Indians. It says, quote, "The utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. Laws founded in justice and humanity shall from time to time be made for preventing wrongs being done to them and for preserving peace and friendship with them." End quote. Well, obviously that didn't happen in practice, because as the settlers began flooding into these frontier areas, conflicts and quarrels happened on the ground, incidents took place, and those very noble sentiments were never honored in practice, unfortunately. But it does speak well for the good intentions of the Congress in settling the Old Northwest. All right, finally, I want to talk a little bit about the impact of the American Revolution on the institution of slavery. Now, between 1777, while the war was still going on, and the year 1804, the northernmost states in the new nation all moved towards emancipating, setting free their slaves. One state, Massachusetts, abolished slavery all at once because a judge issued a decree that slavery violated the Massachusetts Constitution. And so all the slaves were immediately freed in Massachusetts. But all of the other northern states decided to take a more gradual approach and pass laws which slowly phased out slavery. So they would, for example, say that for all the slaves born after a certain year would be freed, and then 10 years later maybe another group of slaves would be freed. And so, for instance, the last slave to be freed in the state of New York became a free person in the year 1826. So this could be a very long, drawn-out process, but the northern states did eventually emancipate their slaves. Some of the states in the Mid-South, like Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, did not abolish slavery, but they did make it easier for slave owners to set their slaves free if they wanted to. This is called manumission. So, for example, George Washington manumitted all of his slaves in his will in 1799, and Thomas Jefferson wanted to do the same thing, but by the time of his death in 1826, he was so broke that he felt he couldn't afford to do that. He wouldn't have anything to leave to his daughter if he did, and so Jefferson did only freed a few slaves, as we will see later in the course. So because of this development, the number of free blacks in the United States skyrocketed. In 1776, there were only 10,000 free African Americans throughout the U.S., but by the year 1810, there were nearly 200,000. And furthermore, free black adult males were theoretically allowed to vote in all the states, even the southern states, except for Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. So even some southern states allowed blacks to vote, except Virginia, South Carolina, and unfortunately Georgia. Now, some of the states did, however, put special requirements for voting on the books, so that you had to have a certain amount of property in order to vote, and those requirements tended to discriminate against African Americans, who often were not allowed into the best jobs and therefore were poorer by and large than other Americans. So some blacks were prevented from voting for that reason. But technically, in 10 of the original 13 states, blacks were allowed to vote if they were free. However, the number of slaves also increased quite a bit. In 1776, there were 500,000 slaves in the United States. By 1790, there were 700,000. And again, this was largely because of natural increase, because of the birth rate among the slave population, rather than from massive importation of slaves. And so you see that the Revolution did strike a blow against slavery, as at least some people felt it was inconsistent to be advocating freedom and liberty for white Americans while keeping African Americans enslaved. But slavery was by no means out of the picture, and certainly in the 19th century it would undergo a great resurgence, as we shall see in later lectures.